In this demo, I want to show you how timing works using Adobe Animate. Timing first begins when you start and create a new document. Now, regardless the size of your document, the most important thing to keep in mind is your frame rate. Right now, I've got my frame rate set to 24 frames per second. This means within 1 second of animation, it's divided up into 24 different frames. Now, some animations do have different frame rates. Sometimes you'll see 30, 32, even 60 frames per second. But the main thing to know is, regardless the amount of time you have, you need to know how it's divided up so that you can pace each of your keyframes. I've already got a document set up, and we're going to do a simple animation by moving these balls from one side of the screen to the other. Let's have a quick look at our timeline. The first thing to note is how your time is divided up into frames and seconds. Each of the second marks is divided into 24 frames per second. That's how I set up my document. This means the first second has 24 frames, the next second has another 24 or 48 frames, third second, fourth, so on and so forth, each one dividing into 24 separate frames. As I move my objects around the stage, I need to pay attention to where they are on the timeline as well. Also, regarding our objects, everything we have has its own individual layer. This is a good professional practice to get into. It can be complex at times, but the more layers you have, the easier it will be to animate individual objects. So my little timeline has its own individual layer, my red ball has its own layer, and the purple ball has its own layer as well. The final thing we'll pay attention to are all of the different frames we're going to be adding to our timeline. Right now, if it's got a solid dot inside of it, that's known as a keyframe. Keyframes indicate any kind of change in action or position on your timeline and in your scene. Right now, there's no other frames outside of this. So let's start adding frames and animating them along the way. The first one I'm going to do is just going to be the red ball, and I'm going to show you how to do a frame by frame animation. So I'm going to turn off visibility for my purple ball and work just on the red ball frame. Let's have the ball roll from the left to the right hand side within 1 second. If I was a frame by frame animator, here's how I would tackle that solution. First, I know my keyframe needs to be added to the 1 second mark so that I can move my ball to the end. So choosing the 24th frame, that 1 second frame, on the red ball layer, let's insert a keyframe. We can go to Insert, Timeline, and choose Keyframe. By the way, the keyboard shortcut is F6. This gives us a new dot on our timeline, and this will allow us to move the ball into its new position. You'll notice, however, when I do this, on the 24th frame, I lose all of my timeline layer. This is because if you look in our layers, there's no other frames along here. All of these other frames are empty until it reaches here. So as I move my playhead back, you can see it goes back to the left and then to the right. If I want my timelines to show up as well, they need to have some frames on their timeline. So I'm going to choose their 24th frame, and let's insert on their timeline just a regular frame. F5 is the keyboard shortcut. Now that they've got just some regular frames to it, this timeline will stay visible for that entire second. Now let's animate all of the in-between frames. If it takes 24 frames to go all the way from the left to the right, in half the time it should cover half the distance. This means by frame number 12, so I can select frame 12, it should be at this halfway point. Let's insert a new keyframe at frame 12, go into Insert, Timeline, Keyframe. By the way, I know this is frame 12 because I can see it mentioned right here, and also here's half of a second on my timeline. With that frame selected, let's move the ball to the midway point, and also I'll rotate it halfway around. If I go back up to my timeline, I can play it, and you can see by half a second it reaches from one side to the other. I'll even select this one, and let's move it over just a little bit more. All right, it still looks pretty choppy, so let's do all of the in-betweens between these two extremes. Halfway between 1 and 12 is 6 frames, so I'll choose frame 6. With it selected, we'll insert a new keyframe, and we'll move it halfway between there. So this will be about a quarter of the way, and we'll even give it a quarter of a turn. Halfway between 12 and 24 is 18 frames. So we'll insert on its timeline a new keyframe, and we'll do 3/4 of the way there and give it another quarter turn. Now it's starting to look like a good animation. Let's take it a step farther. Let's go in between each one of these one more time. So we'll choose frame number 3. We'll insert another keyframe, move it halfway between there too, and we'll give it 1/8 of a turn. Halfway between 6 and 12 is frame number 9. So let's insert another keyframe, move it halfway between there and there, give it another 1/8 of a turn. Halfway between 12 and 18 is 15. We'll insert another keyframe, a little bit more motion, turn it, and then finally halfway between 18 and 24 is 21. So choosing frame 21, I'll insert another keyframe, move it that part of the way, and give it another 1/8 of a turn. With so many frames added, now when I back up and play my animation, you can see the ball rolls really nicely. Now the more frames I add, the smoother it will be. And as a matter of fact, if I want to play this perfectly, I can go up to Control and down to Test and open up my little test player, and you can see how it plays much better. We'll close this out and return to our animation. You can see with the frame-by-frame animation how this can be very tedious to set up, but it does give you full control over exactly how things look. Let me show you another method that takes advantage of the computer doing all the work for you. I'm going to return my playhead back to frame 1. Let's turn on our purple ball. With the purple ball, we're going to do what's called a tween animation. It's going to do the same thing, moving it from the left side to the right side and doing one rotation in between. So to do this, we'll go to the timeline of 1 second for the purple ball, and let's insert another keyframe. This will indicate the stopping point for the purple ball. Just like the red ball, you can see how it starts and stops. Now, I'm going to select this first frame again, and we're going to insert a classic tween. Whenever we do a classic tween, check out our timeline. This gives me a little arrow that points from the first frame to the last frame or the next frame. Now, when I scrub my timeline over, it does all of the work for me in moving it from this first position to the last position. In addition to this, if I want it to rotate, I can go over to my Properties panel and I can add a rotation to it. Let's have it rotate clockwise 1 time. Now when I press play, it automatically rotates for me and it looks perfect. I don't have to set up every single frame in between each one of these. The computer does all the work for me and it's much faster. Now there are some advantages and disadvantages to tweening and frame-by-frame animations, but these are the two main ones that we'll be using in Adobe Animate. The final thing I'll show you is how to change the speed of your objects once you've established their movement and animation. Remember, the faster things move, the fewer the frames that you have to animate. This means if I wanted my purple ball to move the same distance at half the speed, all I've got to do is change its position on the timeline. So from here, I can select the final frame and let's move it down to the 12th frame. It's still going to move from the left to the right side and rotate once, but it's going to do it in 12, or in this case 13 frames, while the other one is going to move the same distance in 24 frames. We'll back it up, hit play, and you can see how it's moving much faster. If I wanted to do this for the red ball, let's say I wanted the red ball to go even slower. I can select all of their frames. When you select the frames, you'll see very carefully there's usually a yellow or green line at the end. This will allow me to click on the last frames, and I can either compress them or I can expand them out. Let's do it all the way to 2 seconds. You can see now it's the same number of frames, they just stretched it out over a longer area. I'll add some other frames to here so that we can see our timeline. And now the other ball should be moving in 2 seconds, or twice the amount of time that it takes the other ball as well. So within timing, it's very important to know the amount of frames per second you have, the two extremes that you want, and how you want to break down the movement in between those two extremes and how you want it to pace along your timeline.